Have you ever wondered why certain books were deliberately excluded from the Bible you know today? Why ancient texts containing detailed accounts of humanity's earliest encounters with divine beings were deemed too dangerous for public consumption? Tonight, we're about to uncover one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. A collection of sacred writings so controversial, so earth-shattering in their implications, that religious authorities have spent centuries ensuring you would never read them. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another theological discussion. This is forbidden knowledge that has been systematically suppressed by religious institutions, academic establishments, and even government agencies for over a millennium. We're talking about ancient manuscripts that describe supernatural events, divine encounters, and prophetic visions in ways that would fundamentally reshape how you understand Scripture, spirituality, and the very nature of reality itself. Picture this scenario. You're holding a manuscript written 2,000 years ago. Its pages contain eyewitness accounts of angelic beings walking among humanity. Detailed descriptions of heaven and hell that go far beyond anything in your standard Bible, and prophecies so specific, so remarkably accurate in their fulfillment, that they seem to transcend normal human understanding. These weren't fictional stories or mythological tales. These were sacred texts revered by entire communities of believers before being quietly removed from official religious doctrine. The collection we're exploring tonight contains writings that were once considered as authoritative as the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were quoted by church fathers, referenced by theologians, and treasured by believers across the ancient world. Yet, somewhere in the corridors of religious power, a decision was made. These texts were too revealing, too specific, too dangerous to remain in public circulation. But here's what they never expected. In our digital age, these forbidden writings have begun to resurface. Hidden manuscripts discovered in desert caves, ancient libraries opened to scholars, and translations made available to anyone willing to seek them out. The truth they tried to bury is clawing its way back into the light, and what it reveals will shake the foundation of everything you thought you knew about biblical history. Now, before we dive into the specific texts and their explosive revelations, let me establish something crucial about the context we're dealing with. The Bible, as you know it today, didn't just appear fully formed from heaven. It went through a complex, often politically charged process of selection, compilation, and editing that spanned several centuries. What ended up in your modern Bible represents only a fraction of the sacred writings that existed in the early Christian world. During the first few centuries after Christ's ministry, dozens of texts circulated among believers. Letters from apostles, accounts of Jesus' teachings, visions received by prophets, and detailed descriptions of spiritual encounters that went far beyond the sanitized versions we see in standard Scripture. These writings were copied by hand, passed from community to community, and treated with the same reverence as the texts that eventually made it into the official canon. But then something changed. As Christianity became more institutionalized, as it gained political power and official recognition, a process began that would forever alter the landscape of sacred literature. Church councils convened, debates raged, and decisions were made about which texts would be preserved and which would be condemned. The criteria weren't just theological. They were political, cultural, and often deeply personal to those in positions of authority. What emerged from this process was a carefully curated collection designed to support specific doctrinal positions and maintain institutional control. The texts that made it into the official Bible were those that could be interpreted in ways that supported established religious hierarchies. The ones that were excluded often contained material that was too mystical, too specific in its prophetic claims, or too threatening to those who sought to control religious thought and practice. Consider the historical context of these decisions. We're talking about an era when religious authority meant political power, when controlling the narrative of divine revelation could determine the fate of empires. Those who held positions of influence had every reason to suppress texts that might challenge their interpretation of divine truth or undermine their claims to spiritual authority. The process of exclusion wasn't random or accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and often brutal. Manuscripts were burned, their owners persecuted, and entire libraries of sacred literature were destroyed. What survived did so only because dedicated believers risked their lives to hide these texts in caves, walls, and secret chambers where they would remain undiscovered for centuries. This brings us to one of the most remarkable discoveries of the modern era. In 1945, in the desert near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a collection of ancient manuscripts was uncovered that would revolutionize our understanding of early Christianity. These texts, hidden in sealed jars and buried in the sand, contained writings that hadn't been seen by human eyes for over 1,500 years. But the Nag Hammadi discovery was just the beginning. Across the Middle East, archaeologists and scholars have uncovered fragments, complete manuscripts, and entire libraries of forbidden texts. Each discovery reveals more about the rich diversity of early Christian thought and the systematic suppression that followed. What makes these discoveries particularly significant is how they align with references found in the writings of early church fathers. Ancient theologians would quote from texts that modern readers couldn't identify because those texts had been lost or destroyed. Now, as these manuscripts resurface, we can finally read the complete passages that were once considered sacred scripture by entire communities of believers. The theological implications are staggering. These texts don't just fill in gaps in biblical history. They present alternative interpretations of familiar events, provide detailed accounts of supernatural encounters that are barely mentioned in canonical scripture, and offer prophetic insights that seem to transcend the limitations of their historical context. Take, for example, the detailed descriptions of angelic hierarchies found in these forbidden texts. While your standard Bible mentions angels in passing, these suppressed manuscripts contain elaborate accounts of their appearance, their roles in divine administration, and their ongoing interactions with humanity. The level of detail is so specific, so consistent across different texts and time periods, that it suggests access to information that goes far beyond human imagination or theological speculation. Even more remarkable are the prophetic elements contained within these writings. Many of these texts contain predictions about future events that have been fulfilled with stunning accuracy throughout history. They describe the rise and fall of empires, the spread of religions across the globe, and even technological developments that wouldn't occur for centuries after the manuscripts were written. But here's where the narrative becomes truly disturbing. The suppression of these texts wasn't just about theological disagreement or scholarly debate. Evidence suggests that the exclusion was motivated by the desire to control access to specific types of spiritual knowledge and prophetic insight. The forbidden texts often contain detailed instructions for spiritual practices, descriptions of mystical experiences, and methods for developing direct communication with divine beings. This type of material threatens institutional religious authority because it suggests that individuals can access divine truth directly, without requiring intermediary priests or official interpretation. Even more threatening were the prophetic elements that named specific bloodlines, geographical locations, and future events with a precision that seemed impossible to explain through normal human knowledge. If these prophecies were authentic, they represented a form of divine revelation that operated outside the control of established religious institutions. The systematic suppression becomes even more disturbing when we examine what happened to communities that continued to preserve and study these texts. Throughout history, groups that maintained access to forbidden manuscripts often faced persecution, exile, or worse. The Inquisition specifically targeted individuals who possessed certain types of suppressed writings, and entire libraries were destroyed to prevent the spread of what authorities deemed dangerous knowledge. This pattern of suppression continued well into the modern era. Even as archaeological discoveries brought these texts back to light, access remained restricted to a small circle of scholars and researchers. Academic institutions that should have been eager to explore these remarkable manuscripts instead worked to limit their availability and discourage serious study of their contents. The translation process itself became a battleground. When suppressed texts were finally made available to modern readers, the translations often reflected the theological biases of the translators, rather than the clear meaning of the original languages. Key passages were softened, controversial elements were downplayed, and the most explosive revelations were buried in footnotes or academic commentary that few general readers would ever encounter. But despite these ongoing suppression efforts, the digital age has made it increasingly difficult to control access to information. Independent scholars, private researchers, and dedicated believers have worked to create accurate translations and make these texts available to anyone seeking to understand the full scope of ancient spiritual literature. What emerges from a careful study of these forbidden writings is a picture of early Christianity that is far more diverse, mystical, and prophetically oriented than the sanitized version presented in mainstream religious education. These texts reveal communities of believers who experienced direct supernatural encounters, received detailed prophetic visions, and maintained spiritual practices that enabled ongoing communication with divine beings. The implications extend far beyond historical curiosity or theological speculation. If these texts represent authentic spiritual experiences and divine revelations, then our understanding of human spiritual potential needs fundamental revision. The suppressed manuscripts suggest that direct mystical experience, prophetic insight, and supernatural abilities were once considered normal aspects of spiritual life, rather than rare exceptions or fictional accounts. Even more significantly, many of these texts contain prophetic materials that appear to be reaching fulfillment in our current era. Predictions about technological developments, global conflicts, and spiritual awakenings that were written centuries ago seem to describe events unfolding in our contemporary world with remarkable accuracy. This raises profound questions about the nature of prophetic revelation and the reasons why access to these materials was so systematically restricted. If the forbidden texts contain genuine insights into future events and spiritual realities, then their suppression represents more than just theological disagreement. It suggests a deliberate attempt to prevent humanity from accessing knowledge that could fundamentally alter our understanding of our spiritual nature and prophetic destiny. The evidence we'll examine tonight demonstrates that the suppression campaign wasn't random or accidental. It followed specific patterns designed to eliminate texts that contained certain types of information while preserving others that supported established doctrinal positions. The result was a carefully curated religious narrative that served institutional interests rather than providing complete access to ancient spiritual wisdom. As we continue this investigation, we'll explore specific forbidden texts that have been hidden from public view for centuries. We'll examine their contents, analyze their prophetic claims, and investigate why religious authorities were so determined to keep these writings out of your hands. The revelations ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical history, spiritual reality, and the true scope of divine revelation available to humanity. The Forbidden Bible isn't just a collection of ancient curiosities. It's a treasure trove of spiritual knowledge that was deliberately hidden from you. The question is, are you ready to discover what they never wanted you to read? The first text we need to examine is one that was so threatening to established religious authority that merely possessing it could result in death during certain periods of history. The Book of Enoch, once quoted directly by the Apostle Jude in your Standard Bible, contains detailed accounts of angelic beings, prophetic visions, and supernatural events that go far beyond anything you'll find in approved scripture. This isn't some obscure manuscript discovered yesterday. The Book of Enoch was widely circulated and revered in the ancient world. Ethiopian Christians preserved it as canonical scripture for over 1,000 years. Jewish communities quoted from it regularly. Early church fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus referenced it as authoritative divine revelation. Yet somehow, this text that was once considered as sacred as Genesis or Psalms vanished from Western Christianity entirely. Why? What did the Book of Enoch contain that was so dangerous it had to be erased from religious memory? The answer lies in what this forbidden text reveals about the true nature of spiritual warfare, the origins of evil, and the supernatural hierarchy that operates beyond human perception. Unlike the brief, sanitized references to angels found in your standard Bible, Enoch provides detailed descriptions of their appearance, their names, their specific roles, and their ongoing influence in human affairs. But here's where it gets truly explosive. The Book of Enoch doesn't just describe these beings in vague mystical terms. It names them individually, describes their physical characteristics with startling precision, and details their interactions with humanity in ways that read more like eyewitness testimony than theological speculation. Consider this passage from Enoch chapter 6. And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. This isn't the sanitized version of fallen angels you might have heard in church. This is a detailed account of supernatural beings taking human wives, producing hybrid offspring, and fundamentally altering the genetic makeup of early humanity. The text goes on to describe how these angelic beings taught humanity forbidden knowledge, the secrets of warfare, the making of weapons, the arts of seduction, and the manipulation of natural forces. The implications are staggering. According to this forbidden text, much of what we consider advanced human knowledge didn't develop naturally through human innovation. It was taught to us by beings from another realm who had their own agenda for humanity's development. But the Book of Enoch doesn't stop there. It provides detailed descriptions of Enoch's journeys through the heavenly realms, complete with measurements, architectural details, and conversations with beings of such power and glory that their very presence would destroy ordinary humans. These aren't vague mystical experiences. They're precise, technical descriptions that read like a supernatural travelogue. Even more remarkable are the prophetic elements contained within this forbidden text. Enoch describes future events with such specificity that scholars have struggled to explain how an ancient writer could have possessed such detailed knowledge of developments that wouldn't occur for thousands of years. The text predicts the coming of a Messiah, describes his ministry in terms that align perfectly with the gospel accounts, and even provides details about the end times that seem to describe technological and social developments that are only now beginning to unfold. This level of prophetic accuracy explains why religious authorities became increasingly uncomfortable with the Book of Enoch. If the text's predictions about past events proved accurate, what did that suggest about its descriptions of future developments that hadn't yet occurred? The suppression began gradually. Church councils started questioning the text's authenticity. Theologians argued about its proper interpretation. Academic debates emerged about whether it should be considered canonical scripture or merely historical curiosity. But the real turning point came when institutional Christianity began to consolidate its power and establish official doctrine. The Book of Enoch presented several problems for religious authorities seeking to maintain control over spiritual truth and prophetic interpretation. First, the text suggested that individuals could receive direct divine revelation without requiring institutional mediation. Enoch's journeys through the heavenly realms implied that such supernatural experiences were possible for ordinary humans who maintained proper spiritual alignment. Second, the detailed descriptions of angelic hierarchies and supernatural warfare suggested a level of spiritual complexity that went far beyond the simplified good versus evil narrative that religious institutions preferred to promote. Third, and perhaps most threatening, the prophetic elements in the text provided specific predictions about future events that could be verified independently of religious authority. If people could test the text's prophetic accuracy for themselves, they might begin to question why this material had been excluded from official scripture. The solution was systematic suppression. Manuscripts were removed from libraries. Translations were discouraged. References to the text in other writings were edited out or explained away. Within a few centuries, the Book of Enoch had virtually disappeared from Western Christian consciousness. But the suppression wasn't limited to the Book of Enoch. Similar treatment was given to dozens of other texts that contained material deemed too dangerous for public consumption. The Gospel of Thomas, which contains 114 sayings attributed directly to Jesus, was excluded because it presented a more mystical, individualistic approach to spirituality than institutional Christianity preferred. The Gospel of Philip was suppressed because it contained detailed descriptions of sacred rituals and mystical practices that suggested direct spiritual experience was more important than doctrinal adherence. The Apocalypse of Peter was excluded because its descriptions of heaven and hell were so vivid and specific that they might compete with official religious teaching about the afterlife. Each of these texts was suppressed for similar reasons. They contained information that threatened institutional control over spiritual truth, prophetic interpretation, and religious authority. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when we examine the criteria used to determine which texts would be preserved and which would be destroyed. The decisions weren't based primarily on theological accuracy or spiritual value. They were based on whether the texts supported the power structures that religious institutions were trying to establish and maintain. Texts that emphasized individual spiritual experience were excluded in favor of those that stressed the importance of church hierarchy. Writings that provided detailed prophetic information were suppressed to prevent people from testing religious claims independently. Materials that described advanced spiritual practices were hidden to maintain the idea that such abilities were reserved for special religious figures rather than being available to ordinary believers. The result was a carefully curated religious narrative that served institutional interests rather than providing complete access to ancient spiritual wisdom. The Bible you know today represents only a fraction of the sacred literature that was once available to early Christian communities. But here's what the suppressors never anticipated. The digital age would make it increasingly difficult to control access to information. Ancient manuscripts that were hidden in desert caves for over 1,000 years have been discovered, translated, and made available online. Texts that survived only in fragments have been reconstructed by dedicated scholars. Translations that were once restricted to academic circles are now accessible to anyone with an internet connection. This means that for the first time in over a millennium, ordinary people can read the complete texts that were deliberately excluded from the Bible. They can examine the evidence for themselves, test the prophetic claims, and explore the spiritual practices described in these forbidden writings. The implications are profound. If these texts contain authentic divine revelation, then our understanding of spiritual reality needs fundamental revision. The suppressed manuscripts suggest that direct mystical experience, prophetic insight, and supernatural abilities were once considered normal aspects of spiritual life rather than rare exceptions. Even more significantly, many of these forbidden texts contain prophetic material that appears to be reaching fulfillment in our current era. Predictions about technological developments, global conflicts, and spiritual awakenings that were written centuries ago seem to describe events unfolding in our contemporary world with remarkable accuracy. This raises disturbing questions about why access to this information was so systematically restricted. If the forbidden texts contain genuine insights into spiritual reality and future events, then their suppression represents more than just theological disagreement. It suggests a deliberate attempt to prevent humanity from accessing knowledge that could fundamentally alter our understanding of our spiritual nature and prophetic destiny. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine specific prophecies from these forbidden texts that have been fulfilled with stunning precision throughout history. The Book of Enoch describes the corruption of human bloodlines through supernatural intervention, leading to a global cleansing that would preserve only righteous genetic lines for future generations. This prophetic framework helps explain historical events that seem inexplicable from a purely materialistic perspective. The rise and fall of civilizations, the preservation of certain bloodlines through global catastrophes, and the systematic suppression of knowledge about humanity's supernatural origins all begin to make sense when viewed through the lens of these forbidden prophecies. But perhaps the most significant aspect of these suppressed texts is what they reveal about human potential and spiritual destiny. Rather than presenting humanity as fallen creatures dependent on institutional salvation, the forbidden writings describe humans as beings with inherent divine potential, who can develop direct communication with supernatural realms through proper spiritual discipline. This perspective threatens the fundamental basis of institutional religious authority because it suggests that the most profound spiritual truths and experiences are available to anyone willing to pursue them seriously, regardless of their relationship to official religious organizations. The systematic suppression of this knowledge represents one of the greatest crimes against human spiritual development in recorded history. By preventing entire populations from accessing these texts, religious authorities have limited humanity's understanding of its true nature and ultimate potential for thousands of years. Yet, the ancient prophecies suggest that this suppression is temporary and will eventually give way to a great revelation when these hidden truths would be restored to humanity. Many of these forbidden texts describe a coming time when all secret knowledge would be revealed, when suppressed wisdom would emerge from darkness, and when humanity would rediscover its true spiritual heritage. The timing of recent archaeological discoveries and the sudden availability of these texts through digital technology suggests that we may be witnessing the fulfillment of these ancient prophecies about the restoration of hidden knowledge. As we continue this investigation, we'll examine specific passages from these forbidden texts that provide detailed insights into spiritual reality, prophetic fulfillment, and human potential that have been systematically hidden from public view. The revelations ahead will demonstrate why religious authorities were so determined to keep these writings out of your hands, and what you can discover when you finally have access to the complete picture of ancient spiritual wisdom. The Forbidden Bible isn't just about historical curiosity or theological speculation. It's about reclaiming knowledge that was stolen from you, and discovering truths that could fundamentally transform your understanding of spiritual reality and your own divine potential. The deeper we venture into these forbidden territories, the more we discover that what was hidden goes far beyond individual texts or isolated manuscripts. We're dealing with an entire system of spiritual knowledge that was systematically dismantled and erased from human consciousness. The texts we've examined so far represent just the visible tip of an iceberg that extends into the deepest foundations of how we understand reality itself. But here's where our investigation takes a truly shocking turn. The suppression wasn't just about removing inconvenient books from circulation. Evidence suggests there was a coordinated campaign to eliminate entire categories of spiritual experience and prophetic understanding from human awareness. We're talking about the deliberate destruction of knowledge systems that had been preserved and transmitted for thousands of years. Consider what happened to the practice of prophecy itself. In the earliest Christian communities, prophetic gifts were considered normal and expected aspects of spiritual life. The Apostle Paul instructed believers to earnestly desire spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. Yet, within a few centuries, prophecy had been relegated to the realm of historical curiosity, something that happened in biblical times but was no longer available to contemporary believers. This wasn't a natural development or a gradual fading of spiritual abilities. It was the result of systematic discouragement and institutional suppression of practices that enabled direct divine communication. Church authorities began teaching that prophecy had ceased with the completion of the biblical canon, effectively eliminating one of the most powerful forms of spiritual experience from Christian practice. The forbidden texts reveal why this suppression was necessary from an institutional perspective. When individuals can receive direct divine revelation, they become far more difficult to control through religious hierarchy. If people can access prophetic insight independently, they don't need to rely on official interpretation of spiritual truth. This represents a fundamental threat to any organization that bases its authority on claiming exclusive access to divine knowledge. But the suppression went even deeper than eliminating prophetic practices. The forbidden manuscripts describe entire schools of spiritual training that taught advanced techniques for developing supernatural abilities. These weren't primitive superstitions or mythological fantasies. They were sophisticated systems of consciousness development that produced documented results in terms of healing, prophecy, and mystical experience. The Gospel of Philip, one of the most thoroughly suppressed texts from early Christianity, contains detailed instructions for spiritual practices that were designed to activate what it calls the divine spark within human consciousness. The text describes specific techniques for achieving direct communion with divine beings, methods for receiving prophetic visions, and practices for developing healing abilities that transcend normal medical understanding. But here's what makes this particularly explosive. The techniques described in these forbidden texts weren't just theoretical or symbolic. They were practical methodologies that produced measurable results. Communities that preserved these practices continued to demonstrate supernatural abilities long after they had been officially condemned and suppressed. The systematic elimination of this knowledge represents one of the greatest losses in human spiritual development. Imagine if medical knowledge had been suppressed in a similar way, leaving humanity ignorant of basic healing principles for over 1,000 years. That's essentially what happened to advanced spiritual knowledge and practice. The archaeological record tells a disturbing story about how thorough this suppression campaign actually was. Across the ancient world, libraries that once contained thousands of spiritual texts were systematically destroyed. The Great Library of Alexandria, which housed the largest collection of ancient wisdom in the Western world, was deliberately burned multiple times by religious authorities who considered much of its contents dangerous to official doctrine. But Alexandria wasn't unique. Similar destruction occurred at centers of learning across the Roman Empire, the Byzantine territories, and throughout medieval Europe. Wherever advanced spiritual texts were discovered, they were confiscated and destroyed by religious authorities who claimed they contained heretical or dangerous material. The pattern was consistent and coordinated. This wasn't random destruction or accidental loss. It was a systematic campaign to eliminate specific types of knowledge from human civilization. The texts that were targeted for destruction shared common characteristics. They described direct spiritual experiences, provided practical techniques for developing supernatural abilities, or contained prophetic material that could be verified independently of religious authority. What survived this campaign of destruction did so only because dedicated individuals risked their lives to hide these texts in remote locations where they wouldn't be discovered for centuries. The manuscripts found at Nag Hammadi, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and other archaeological discoveries represent only a tiny fraction of the spiritual literature that once existed in the ancient world. But even more disturbing is evidence suggesting that the suppression campaign continued well into the modern era. When archaeologists began discovering these hidden manuscripts in the 19th and 20th centuries, access to them was immediately restricted by academic and religious institutions. Translations were delayed for decades, and when they were finally released, they were often edited or interpreted in ways that minimized their most controversial elements. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide a perfect example of this ongoing suppression. Discovered in 1947, these manuscripts contained some of the most significant archaeological finds in human history. Yet for over 40 years, access to the complete collection was restricted to a small circle of scholars who controlled their translation and interpretation. When independent researchers finally gained access to the complete scrolls, they discovered that the restricted manuscripts contained material that was far more controversial than the portions that had been made publicly available. Some texts described prophetic visions that seemed to predict future events with impossible accuracy. Others contained detailed accounts of supernatural encounters that went far beyond anything in mainstream religious literature. Even more significantly, several of the scrolls contained references to spiritual practices and mystical techniques that aligned perfectly with the methods described in other forbidden texts. This suggested that advanced spiritual knowledge had been preserved and transmitted by secret communities long after it had been officially suppressed. The implications become truly staggering when we examine what these hidden communities were able to accomplish. Historical records, though fragmentary and often coded to avoid persecution, describe groups that maintained the ability to perform healings, receive prophetic visions, and demonstrate other supernatural abilities throughout periods when such practices were officially condemned as impossible or demonic. These communities didn't just preserve ancient texts. They maintained living traditions of spiritual practice that enabled ongoing supernatural experience. They developed techniques for activating dormant human capabilities that mainstream religion taught were either fictional or reserved for special religious figures. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to our contemporary situation. Many of these hidden traditions have begun to resurface in recent decades. Ancient practices that were preserved in secret for over 1,000 years are being rediscovered and adapted for modern application. Techniques for developing prophetic insight, healing abilities, and direct divine communication are being taught once again to individuals who are hungry for authentic spiritual experience. The timing of this resurgence correlates perfectly with prophecies found in the forbidden texts themselves. Many of these suppressed manuscripts describe a future time when hidden knowledge would be revealed, when suppressed wisdom would emerge from darkness, and when humanity would rediscover its true spiritual potential. The Book of Enoch specifically prophesies about a generation that would witness the restoration of ancient knowledge. And in those days, the elect and holy children will descend from the high heaven, and their seed will become one with the children of men. And in those days Enoch received books of zeal and wrath, and books of disquiet and expulsion. And mercy shall not be accorded to them, saith the Lord of spirits. This prophetic passage describes a time when suppressed knowledge would return to humanity, when ancient wisdom would be restored, and when those who had hidden this knowledge would be exposed. The correlation between this ancient prophecy and contemporary developments in archaeological discovery and spiritual awakening is impossible to ignore. But the restoration process isn't just about rediscovering old texts or ancient practices. The forbidden manuscripts suggest that the suppressed knowledge was preserved for a specific purpose: to prepare humanity for a transformation that would fundamentally alter our spiritual capabilities and our relationship with divine reality. Several of the forbidden texts describe coming developments that would enable ordinary humans to access levels of consciousness and spiritual ability that had previously been available only to specially trained individuals. They speak of a time when prophetic gifts would be widely distributed, when healing abilities would become common, and when direct communication with divine beings would be restored as a normal aspect of human experience. The prophetic descriptions in these texts align remarkably with contemporary reports of spiritual awakening that are occurring across the globe. Growing numbers of individuals report spontaneous mystical experiences, prophetic dreams that prove accurate, and healing abilities that manifest without formal training or religious authorization. These phenomena are occurring simultaneously across different cultures, religions, and geographical regions, suggesting that we may be witnessing the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about the restoration of suppressed spiritual knowledge and capabilities. The implications extend far beyond individual spiritual development into realms of collective transformation that could revolutionize human consciousness and capability. If the forbidden texts contain accurate prophecies about this restoration process, then we're living through one of the most significant periods in human spiritual history. But understanding these developments requires access to the complete picture of ancient spiritual wisdom, including the texts that were deliberately hidden from public view. The suppressed manuscripts provide crucial context for interpreting contemporary spiritual phenomena and understanding their significance within the larger framework of prophetic fulfillment. This is why the ongoing efforts to restrict access to these texts remain so problematic. Even today, certain manuscripts remain locked away in private collections or restricted archives, available only to approved researchers who often have institutional reasons to minimize their most controversial elements. The digital age has made it increasingly difficult to maintain these restrictions, but the suppression campaign continues through more subtle methods. Academic institutions discourage serious study of these materials by labeling them as pseudepigraphic or historically unreliable. Religious organizations dismiss them as heretical or dangerous to faith. Media outlets ignore or ridicule claims about their significance. Yet despite these ongoing suppression efforts, the truth continues to emerge. Independent scholars are creating accurate translations and making them freely available online. Researchers are analyzing the prophetic claims and demonstrating their historical accuracy. Practitioners are rediscovering the spiritual techniques described in these texts and documenting their effectiveness. The restoration of this knowledge represents more than just historical or academic interest. It offers practical tools for developing spiritual capabilities that have been dormant in human consciousness for over a millennium. The forbidden texts describe specific methods for activating prophetic insight, developing healing abilities, and establishing direct communication with divine realms. These aren't vague mystical concepts or theoretical possibilities. They're practical techniques that produce measurable results when properly applied. The communities that preserved these practices throughout the centuries of suppression demonstrated their effectiveness consistently, even when doing so put them at risk of persecution or death. The question facing us today is whether we'll take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to reclaim our spiritual heritage, or whether we'll allow the suppression to continue through ignorance, fear, or institutional pressure. The forbidden texts suggest that this choice isn't just individual, but collective. They describe the current period as a time of testing, when humanity would have the opportunity to embrace its true spiritual potential or remain trapped in the limitations that have been artificially imposed through systematic suppression of spiritual knowledge. The outcome of this choice will determine not just individual spiritual development, but the direction of human consciousness evolution for generations to come. The suppressed wisdom offers tools for transcending the conflicts, limitations, and suffering that have characterized human existence throughout the age of spiritual suppression. But accessing this potential requires more than just reading forbidden texts or learning ancient techniques. It requires the courage to challenge institutional authorities that benefit from maintaining spiritual ignorance, the wisdom to discern authentic spiritual experience from counterfeit substitutes, and the dedication to develop capabilities that have been dormant for centuries. The Forbidden Bible isn't just about recovering lost knowledge. It's about reclaiming human spiritual potential that was systematically suppressed to maintain systems of control that depend on spiritual ignorance and dependence. As we approach the culmination of our investigation, we'll examine specific techniques described in these suppressed texts for developing prophetic insight and supernatural abilities. We'll explore how ancient communities maintained these practices despite centuries of persecution, and we'll investigate why the restoration of this knowledge may be essential for humanity's future spiritual development. The revelations ahead will demonstrate that the forbidden texts don't just describe historical events or theological concepts. They provide practical guidance for developing capabilities that could fundamentally transform human consciousness and our relationship with spiritual reality. The choice to explore this knowledge carries risks. Those who maintained these traditions throughout history often faced persecution, exile, or worse. But it also offers possibilities that extend far beyond anything available through conventional religious or spiritual practice. The Forbidden Bible represents more than suppressed history or alternative theology. It's a roadmap to spiritual capabilities that were once considered normal aspects of human development, but have been systematically eliminated from contemporary awareness. The question is, are you ready to discover what humanity was meant to become before this knowledge was stolen from us? Are you prepared to explore spiritual territories that religious authorities never wanted you to enter? The journey ahead will challenge everything you've been taught about the limitations of human consciousness and the possibilities available through authentic spiritual development. The suppression campaign succeeded in hiding this knowledge for over 1,000 years, but the digital age and archaeological discoveries have created an opportunity to reclaim what was stolen from humanity. Whether we take advantage of this opportunity or allow it to pass depends on our willingness to seek truth regardless of institutional opposition or cultural conditioning. The forbidden texts await your exploration. The choice of whether to remain in spiritual ignorance or embrace your true potential rests entirely in your hands. Now, let me reveal something that will completely shatter your understanding of biblical prophecy and challenge everything you've been taught about the end times. Hidden within these forbidden texts are prophetic visions so detailed, so specific in their predictions about our current world, that they seem to have been written yesterday rather than 2,000 years ago. We're talking about manuscripts that describe technological developments, global conflicts, and spiritual phenomena that are unfolding right now in ways that seem impossible to explain through normal human foresight. The most explosive of these prophetic texts is one that was completely removed from Christian consciousness by the 4th century. The Apocalypse of Paul, also known as the Visio Pauli, contains detailed descriptions of the Apostle Paul's journey through heavenly and hellish realms, guided by an angel who shows him the fate of different types of souls and reveals future events that would unfold on earth. But here's what makes this text absolutely terrifying to religious authorities. It doesn't just describe vague spiritual concepts or symbolic visions. It provides specific details about technological capabilities, social structures, and global events that align perfectly with developments in our modern world. The text describes devices that allow instant communication across vast distances, flying machines that carry people through the air, and weapons of such destructive power that they could eliminate entire cities in moments. When this manuscript was circulating in the early Christian world, such descriptions would have seemed like pure fantasy. No one could have imagined the technological capabilities that Paul's vision described. Yet today, we're living in the exact reality that this forbidden text predicted would exist in the final generation before divine judgment. The suppression of this particular manuscript reveals just how sophisticated the campaign against prophetic knowledge actually was. Church authorities didn't just remove texts that contained theological disagreements or mystical practices. They specifically targeted writings that provided detailed information about future events, especially those that described the conditions that would exist immediately before the end times. Why would they do this? Because prophetic knowledge represents the ultimate threat to institutional control. If people can access accurate information about future events independently, they don't need to rely on religious authorities for guidance about what's coming. Even more threatening, if the prophecies prove accurate in their predictions about past events, people might start taking seriously their descriptions of future developments that haven't yet occurred. The Apocalypse of Paul contains prophecies about the final generation that are so specific they read like a description of contemporary global conditions. The text describes a time when knowledge shall increase, and men shall travel to and fro upon the earth with great speed. It speaks of a generation that would possess devices that capture images and sounds from distant places, and machines that think and speak like men. But the prophetic accuracy becomes even more disturbing when we examine the text's descriptions of social and spiritual conditions in the end times. Paul's vision describes a period when truth shall be called lies, and lies shall be called truth, when men shall call good evil and evil good, and when the love of many shall wax cold, despite unprecedented material prosperity. The correlation between these ancient prophecies and contemporary social conditions is impossible to dismiss. We're living in an era of unprecedented technological capability combined with moral confusion, spiritual emptiness, and social fragmentation that aligns perfectly with the conditions described in texts that were written nearly 2,000 years ago. Even more remarkable are the prophecies about the restoration of Israel as a nation, the development of global communication systems, and the emergence of a one-world government that would control economic activity through technological means. The Apocalypse of Paul describes these developments not as distant possibilities, but as signs that would indicate the approaching end of the current age. But here's where the suppression becomes truly sinister. The forbidden texts don't just predict these developments. They provide detailed information about how to interpret them spiritually, how to prepare for what's coming, and how to develop the spiritual discernment necessary to navigate the deceptions that would characterize the final period of human history. The Book of Enoch contains perhaps the most detailed prophetic timeline of any ancient text, describing specific periods of human history and the signs that would mark the transition from one era to another. The text's predictions about the corruption of human bloodlines, the development of advanced technology, and the spiritual warfare that would intensify in the final generation have proven remarkably accurate throughout history. But the most controversial aspect of Enoch's prophecies involves its descriptions of the return of the Watchers, the angelic beings who supposedly corrupted humanity in the antediluvian period. The text suggests that these entities would return in the final generation, using advanced technology to deceive humanity and establish a global system of control. This prophetic framework provides a supernatural explanation for technological developments that seem to transcend normal human innovation. If the forbidden texts are accurate, then much of our advanced technology may represent the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about non-human intelligence, influencing human development during the end times. The suppression of this prophetic material prevented generations of believers from understanding the spiritual significance of technological advancement and global political developments. By hiding these texts, Religious authorities ensured that people would be unprepared to interpret contemporary events within a prophetic framework. But the consequences of this suppression extend far beyond theological understanding into practical preparation for what the texts describe as coming global upheaval. The forbidden prophecies provide specific guidance about how to maintain spiritual discernment during periods of intense deception, how to prepare for economic collapse and social chaos, and how to develop the spiritual capabilities necessary to survive what they describe as the greatest period of tribulation in human history. The fourth book of Ezra, another suppressed prophetic text, contains detailed descriptions of the signs that would precede the end of the current age. The text describes natural disasters, political upheavals, and spiritual phenomena that align remarkably with contemporary global conditions. But what makes this text particularly significant is its description of the spiritual awakening that would occur simultaneously with these external signs. Ezra's vision describes a period when many shall receive wisdom and understanding, and when the secrets of the Most High shall be revealed to those who seek them with pure hearts. This prophecy seems to be reaching fulfillment through the rediscovery of suppressed texts and the growing interest in advanced spiritual knowledge among contemporary seekers. The same period that witnesses global chaos and deception also sees the restoration of ancient wisdom and the development of spiritual capabilities that have been dormant for centuries. The timing of these developments suggests that we're witnessing the fulfillment of multiple prophetic streams simultaneously. The external signs described in the forbidden texts are manifesting in global politics, economics, and natural phenomena, while the internal signs are appearing through spiritual awakening and the rediscovery of suppressed knowledge. But understanding these developments requires access to the complete prophetic picture, including the materials that were deliberately excluded from official religious doctrine. The suppressed texts provide crucial context for interpreting contemporary events and understanding their significance within the larger framework of prophetic fulfillment. The Gospel of Bartholomew contains some of the most specific prophecies about the final generation, describing technological capabilities and social conditions that would exist immediately before divine intervention in human affairs. The text's descriptions of artificial beings that serve mankind and devices that know all things and answer all questions seem to predict developments in artificial intelligence and digital technology with impossible accuracy. But the most disturbing aspect of these prophecies involves their descriptions of how advanced technology would be used to control human behavior and eliminate individual freedom. The forbidden texts describe a coming period when no man might buy or sell without accepting a mark or identification system controlled by a global authority. These prophetic descriptions, written centuries before such technological control was possible, now seem to describe developments in digital currency, biometric identification, and social credit systems that are being implemented across the globe. The suppression of this prophetic knowledge prevented people from understanding the spiritual significance of these technological developments and preparing for the challenges they would create. By hiding these texts, authorities ensured that the final generation would be spiritually unprepared for the deceptions and control systems that the prophecies warned would characterize the end times. But the forbidden texts also provide hope through their descriptions of divine intervention that would prevent the complete destruction of humanity and establish a new order based on spiritual rather than technological principles. The prophetic visions describe a coming transformation that would restore direct divine communication, eliminate the systems of deception and control, and establish justice based on spiritual truth rather than human manipulation. The second book of Enoch contains detailed descriptions of this coming transformation, describing how the righteous would be preserved through the period of global upheaval and given supernatural abilities that would enable them to serve as leaders in the restored world order. These prophecies suggest that the same period that witnesses the greatest deception and oppression in human history would also see the greatest outpouring of divine power and spiritual capability. The restoration of suppressed knowledge and the development of advanced spiritual abilities would provide the tools necessary to overcome the technological and political systems designed to control humanity. But accessing this prophetic guidance requires more than just reading ancient texts or studying theological concepts. The forbidden manuscripts describe specific spiritual disciplines and practices that would enable individuals to receive direct prophetic insight and develop the discernment necessary to navigate the deceptions of the final period. The Testament of Abraham contains detailed instructions for developing prophetic vision through prayer, fasting, and meditation practices that were systematically eliminated from mainstream religious practice. The text describes techniques for receiving divine guidance about future events and developing the spiritual sensitivity necessary to distinguish between authentic and deceptive spiritual experiences. These practical instructions were suppressed along with the prophetic texts because they enabled individuals to access divine guidance independently of religious institutions. If people could receive accurate prophetic information directly, they wouldn't need to depend on official interpretations of current events or future developments. The restoration of these prophetic capabilities becomes crucial as we enter the period described in the forbidden texts as the time of greatest deception in human history. The manuscripts warn that the final generation would face unprecedented spiritual warfare, with false signs and wonders designed to mislead even those who consider themselves spiritually discerning. But they also promise that those who maintain proper spiritual discipline and seek divine guidance with sincere hearts would receive the revelation necessary to understand the true significance of contemporary events and prepare effectively for what's coming. The Assumption of Moses describes the spiritual preparation necessary for surviving the final tribulation, providing specific guidance about maintaining faith during periods when truth is systematically suppressed and deception is promoted through every available communication channel. The text's descriptions of information warfare, psychological manipulation, and the use of technology to control human perception seem to predict contemporary developments in media manipulation, social engineering, and digital propaganda with remarkable accuracy. But the most hopeful aspect of these prophetic texts is their consistent message that the period of deception and oppression would be relatively brief, followed by divine intervention that would establish truth, justice, and spiritual enlightenment as the governing principles of human civilization. The forbidden prophecy suggests that those who understand these developments spiritually and prepare accordingly would not only survive the coming upheaval, but would serve as leaders and teachers in the restored world order that would follow. This prophetic framework provides crucial context for understanding why access to these texts was so systematically suppressed, and why their restoration in our current era may be essential for humanity's spiritual survival during the challenging period ahead. The prophecies contained in these forbidden manuscripts aren't just historical curiosities or theological speculation. They provide practical guidance for understanding and navigating the most significant period of transformation in human history. But accessing this guidance requires the courage to seek truth beyond the boundaries established by institutional authorities who benefit from maintaining prophetic ignorance. The suppressed texts offer tools for developing spiritual discernment, prophetic insight, and divine guidance that could prove essential for surviving and thriving during the period they describe as humanity's final test. The choice to explore this prophetic knowledge carries significant implications. Those who understand what's coming according to these ancient visions have responsibilities to prepare not just themselves, but to serve as sources of wisdom and guidance for others who may be unprepared for the challenges ahead. The forbidden prophecy suggests that the restoration of this knowledge in our current era isn't accidental, but represents the fulfillment of divine promises that truth would be revealed, and spiritual capabilities restored when they would be most needed for humanity's survival and transformation. Whether we take advantage of this unprecedented access to suppressed prophetic knowledge or allow it to remain hidden through ignorance or institutional pressure will determine not just individual spiritual development, but the outcome of humanity's greatest spiritual test. The prophetic texts await your study. The choice of whether to remain prophetically ignorant or embrace the divine guidance available through these suppressed revelations rests entirely in your hands. But time may be more limited than most people realize, and the window of opportunity for accessing this crucial knowledge may not remain open indefinitely. The evidence becomes even more disturbing when we examine how these suppression tactics evolved in the modern era. What we're dealing with isn't just ancient history or medieval censorship. This is an ongoing campaign that has adapted to contemporary methods of information control, using sophisticated psychological techniques and institutional pressure to maintain the barriers between you and the spiritual knowledge that was meant to be your birthright. Consider what happened during the 20th century as archaeological discoveries began to unearth manuscripts that had been hidden for over a millennium. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, the initial excitement from the academic community quickly gave way to systematic delays, restricted access, and carefully controlled translation processes that took decades to complete. But here's what most people don't realize. The delays weren't due to the complexity of translation or the fragility of the materials. Internal documents from the institutions controlling these manuscripts revealed that the real concern was the controversial nature of their contents and the potential impact on established religious doctrine. Several of the scrolls contained prophetic texts that described future events with such specificity that their accuracy seemed to transcend normal human foresight. Others provided detailed accounts of spiritual practices and mystical experiences that went far beyond anything in approved religious literature. Most threatening of all were manuscripts that seemed to validate the authenticity of texts that had been officially condemned as heretical centuries earlier. The solution was a carefully orchestrated campaign of academic gatekeeping. Access to the complete collection was restricted to a small circle of scholars who could be trusted to interpret the findings in ways that wouldn't threaten established religious or academic interests. Translations were delayed, controversial passages were downplayed, and the most explosive revelations were buried in footnotes or technical commentary that few general readers would ever encounter. This pattern of modern suppression extends far beyond the Dead Sea Scrolls into every aspect of how ancient spiritual texts are studied, translated, and presented to the public. University departments that should be eager to explore these remarkable manuscripts instead discourage serious research into their most controversial elements. Academic careers have been destroyed for pursuing studies that challenge mainstream interpretations of suppressed materials. The psychological warfare dimension of this campaign becomes apparent when we examine how public perception of these texts has been systematically shaped. Rather than presenting them as potentially authentic spiritual documents worthy of serious consideration, they're consistently labeled as pseudepigraphic, Gnostic, or historically unreliable. Terms designed to create immediate skepticism in the minds of potential readers. But here's what the suppressors never anticipated. The digital revolution would make it increasingly difficult to control access to information. Independent scholars working outside institutional constraints have created accurate translations and made them freely available online. Private researchers have analyzed the prophetic claims and demonstrated their historical accuracy. Dedicated believers have rediscovered the spiritual practices described in these texts and documented their effectiveness. The result is an unprecedented situation where ordinary people can access forbidden knowledge that was once restricted to a tiny elite of approved scholars and religious authorities. For the first time in over 1,000 years, you can read the complete texts that were deliberately excluded from the Bible and judge their authenticity for yourself. This democratization of access to suppressed spiritual knowledge represents a fundamental threat to systems of control that depend on maintaining religious ignorance and spiritual dependence. When people can access divine truth directly through these ancient texts, they become far more difficult to manipulate through institutional authority or cultural conditioning. The response has been an intensification of suppression tactics adapted for the digital age. Rather than physical destruction of manuscripts, we now see sophisticated campaigns of disinformation, character assassination of researchers who promote these texts, and algorithmic suppression of content that discusses their significance. Search engines have been programmed to prioritize mainstream religious and academic sources while burying independent research and alternative translations. Social media platforms restrict the reach of content that discusses forbidden texts or challenges official religious doctrine. Academic databases make it difficult to find scholarly articles that take these manuscripts seriously as authentic spiritual documents. Even more insidiously, fake translations and deliberately misleading interpretations have been circulated to confuse and discourage serious seekers. When people search for these forbidden texts online, they often encounter versions that have been edited, mistranslated, or presented in ways that make them seem irrelevant or inauthentic. But despite these sophisticated suppression efforts, the truth continues to emerge through the dedication of individuals who refuse to accept institutional gatekeeping of spiritual knowledge. The proliferation of accurate translations, the growth of online communities dedicated to studying these texts, and the increasing reports of spiritual experiences that align with their descriptions suggest that the suppression campaign may finally be failing. The implications become truly revolutionary when we consider what widespread access to this forbidden knowledge could accomplish. If millions of people began studying these suppressed texts seriously, developing the spiritual practices they describe, and testing their prophetic claims against contemporary events, it could trigger a spiritual awakening that would fundamentally transform human consciousness. This is precisely what the suppression campaign was designed to prevent. The systematic elimination of these texts from public awareness wasn't just about theological control or institutional authority. It was about preventing humanity from accessing spiritual capabilities and prophetic insights that could enable us to transcend the limitations that have been artificially imposed through centuries of spiritual ignorance. The forbidden texts describe human beings as creatures with inherent divine potential who can develop direct communication with supernatural realms, receive prophetic guidance about future events, and manifest healing abilities that transcend medical understanding. This perspective presents humanity not as fallen creatures dependent on institutional salvation, but as spiritual beings temporarily limited by ignorance of their true nature and capabilities. When this knowledge becomes widely available, it threatens every system of control that depends on maintaining human spiritual ignorance and dependence. Religious institutions that claim exclusive access to divine truth lose their authority when people can communicate with divine beings directly. Political systems that depend on fear and manipulation lose their power when people can receive prophetic guidance about future events. Economic structures that exploit human desperation lose their effectiveness when people can access supernatural provision through spiritual alignment. The restoration of suppressed spiritual knowledge represents more than just historical recovery or theological revision. It offers practical tools for transcending the conflicts, limitations, and suffering that have characterized human existence throughout the age of spiritual suppression. But accessing this potential requires more than just reading forbidden texts or learning ancient techniques. It demands the courage to challenge institutional authorities who benefit from maintaining spiritual ignorance, the wisdom to discern authentic spiritual experience from counterfeit substitutes, and the dedication to develop capabilities that have been systematically suppressed for over a millennium. The evidence suggests we're living through a unique historical moment when this choice is actually available to ordinary individuals. The convergence of archaeological discoveries, digital technology, and growing spiritual hunger has created unprecedented opportunities for reclaiming knowledge that was stolen from humanity centuries ago. Yet the window of opportunity may be more limited than most people realize. The same technological systems that currently enable access to forbidden knowledge could easily be used to restrict it if the suppression campaign adapts successfully to digital methods of control. Already, we see increasing censorship of spiritual content, algorithmic manipulation of search results, and systematic discrediting of alternative spiritual perspectives. The choice facing humanity today mirrors the choices faced by individuals throughout history who had access to suppressed spiritual knowledge. Do we remain comfortable in familiar limitations, or do we risk everything to explore territories that institutional authorities never wanted us to enter? The forbidden texts suggest that this choice isn't just individual but collective. They describe periods in history when entire civilizations either embraced their spiritual potential and flourished, or rejected it and fell into darkness and decay. The outcome of our contemporary choice may determine the direction of human consciousness evolution for generations to come. Understanding the significance of this moment requires recognizing that we're not just dealing with historical curiosities or alternative religious opinions. The suppressed texts contain practical guidance for developing capabilities that could fundamentally transform human experience and our relationship with spiritual reality. The systematic suppression of this knowledge represents one of the greatest crimes against human potential in recorded history. By preventing entire populations from accessing these texts and developing their spiritual inheritance, religious and political authorities have limited humanity's evolution for over 1,000 years. But the ancient prophecies embedded within these forbidden manuscripts suggest that this suppression was temporary and would eventually give way to a great restoration when humanity would rediscover its true spiritual heritage. The timing of recent discoveries and the sudden availability of these texts through digital technology indicates that we may be witnessing the fulfillment of these prophetic promises about the return of hidden knowledge. The implications extend beyond individual spiritual development into realms of collective transformation that could address humanity's most pressing challenges. The suppressed texts describe spiritual technologies that could revolutionize healing, communication, and our understanding of consciousness itself. They speak of communities that maintained abilities to influence weather patterns, communicate across vast distances without physical technology, and access information about future events that enabled them to prepare for challenges and opportunities long before they manifested in physical reality. These aren't mythological fantasies or primitive superstitions. They're documented capabilities that were systematically suppressed because they threatened systems of control that depend on human limitation and ignorance. The restoration of this knowledge could enable humanity to transcend many of the problems that seem insurmountable from a purely materialistic perspective. Climate change, resource scarcity, social conflict, and psychological suffering might all yield to spiritual solutions that become available when humanity reclaims its suppressed capabilities and begins operating from its true spiritual nature, rather than the artificial limitations that have been imposed through systematic suppression of divine knowledge. But accessing these solutions requires more than just intellectual understanding of suppressed texts. It demands practical application of the spiritual disciplines and consciousness development techniques that these manuscripts describe in detail. The Forbidden Bible isn't just about recovering lost history or alternative theology. It's about reclaiming practical tools for human transformation that were deliberately hidden to maintain systems of control and limitation. The choice to explore this knowledge seriously carries significant implications. Throughout history, individuals who possessed access to suppressed spiritual knowledge often faced persecution, exile, or worse. Even today, those who promote serious study of these texts or claim to have experienced the capabilities they describe often encounter ridicule, professional ostracism, or systematic attempts to discredit their character and credibility. Yet the potential rewards of this exploration extend far beyond anything available through conventional religious or spiritual practice. The forbidden texts describe levels of consciousness, capability, and divine communication that represent humanity's true spiritual inheritance, capabilities that were systematically suppressed to maintain systems of control, but are now becoming available again through the restoration of hidden knowledge. The question facing each individual who encounters this information is whether they will remain satisfied with the limited spiritual options provided by mainstream religious institutions, or whether they will risk everything to explore the full scope of human spiritual potential described in the texts that were deliberately hidden from public view. The suppressed manuscripts await your investigation. The spiritual capabilities they describe are available to anyone willing to pursue them seriously, regardless of their religious background or institutional affiliations. But accessing this knowledge requires moving beyond the boundaries established by authorities who benefit from maintaining spiritual ignorance and limitation. The choice is entirely yours. The Forbidden Bible offers tools for transformation that could revolutionize your understanding of spiritual reality and your own divine potential. Whether you choose to explore these territories or remain within the comfortable confines of approved spiritual knowledge will determine not just your individual development, but your ability to contribute to humanity's collective awakening during this crucial period of spiritual restoration. The ancient knowledge calls to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. The question is, are you ready to answer that call, or will you allow this unprecedented opportunity to pass while remaining trapped in the spiritual limitations that were artificially imposed through centuries of systematic suppression? The texts are waiting. The techniques are available. The only remaining question is whether you possess the courage and dedication necessary to reclaim what was stolen from you and discover who you were meant to become before this knowledge was hidden from humanity. The transformation we're witnessing extends far beyond the rediscovery of ancient manuscripts into something that challenges the very foundations of how spiritual knowledge is transmitted and preserved. What we're dealing with isn't just the restoration of forbidden texts, but the emergence of spiritual capabilities that these manuscripts describe as humanity's birthright, abilities that were systematically suppressed to maintain control over religious experience and divine communication. Consider what happens when individuals begin applying the practical techniques described in these suppressed writings. We're not talking about theoretical theology or academic speculation. These texts contain specific methodologies for developing what they call the gifts of the Spirit, abilities that include prophetic insight, healing through divine energy, and direct communication with angelic beings. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, one of the most thoroughly suppressed texts in Christian history, provides detailed instructions for achieving what it describes as the bridal chamber experience, a mystical union with divine consciousness that enables the practitioner to receive direct revelation without requiring institutional mediation. The text describes specific breathing techniques, meditation practices, and spiritual disciplines that were designed to activate dormant centers of consciousness within the human nervous system. But here's what makes this particularly explosive from an institutional perspective. The Gospel of Mary presents her not as a reformed prostitute or secondary figure, but as Jesus' primary spiritual successor, the one who received the most advanced teachings and was commissioned to transmit them to future generations. The text suggests that the deepest spiritual secrets were entrusted to feminine wisdom traditions that operated parallel to the masculine ecclesiastical structures that eventually dominated Christianity. The systematic suppression of Mary's gospel wasn't just about eliminating a competing narrative. It was about destroying knowledge of spiritual practices that enabled direct divine experience without requiring priestly mediation. If people could access the bridal chamber consciousness that Mary's text describes, they wouldn't need religious institutions to intercede between them and divine reality. The manuscript provides step-by-step instructions for what it calls ascending through the spheres, a technique for expanding consciousness beyond ordinary limitations and accessing higher dimensions of spiritual reality. The descriptions are remarkably similar to advanced meditation practices found in Eastern traditions, suggesting that early Christianity possessed sophisticated consciousness technologies that were deliberately eliminated from Western spiritual development. But the suppression of feminine wisdom traditions represents only one dimension of a much broader campaign against mystical knowledge. The Pistis Sophia, another forbidden text that survived only in fragmentary copies, contains some of the most detailed descriptions of celestial hierarchies and cosmic structure ever recorded in Christian literature. This manuscript presents a universe far more complex and populated than anything described in canonical scripture. It speaks of multiple dimensions of reality, each governed by different orders of spiritual beings, and provides detailed maps for navigating these realms during out-of-body experiences and after-death transitions. The text describes specific prayers, invocations, and spiritual techniques for communicating with beings at different levels of this cosmic hierarchy. It presents what amounts to a complete manual for advanced spiritual practice, including methods for protecting oneself from negative entities, techniques for receiving guidance from benevolent spirits, and practices for developing the spiritual vision necessary to perceive these normally invisible realms. The level of detail in these descriptions suggests either extraordinary imagination or genuine experiential knowledge of non-physical dimensions of reality. The consistency of these accounts across different suppressed texts, written by different authors in different time periods, supports the authenticity of the experiences they describe. But acknowledging the reality of these spiritual dimensions and the techniques for accessing them would fundamentally undermine materialistic worldviews that dominate contemporary culture. If consciousness can exist independently of the physical brain, if communication with non-physical beings is possible, if healing can occur through spiritual energy rather than medical intervention, then our entire understanding of reality needs radical revision. The Thunder. Perfect Mind represents perhaps the most mysterious and philosophically challenging of all suppressed texts. Written as a series of paradoxical statements spoken by a feminine divine voice, it presents a vision of spiritual reality that transcends conventional categories of good and evil, sacred and profane, divine and human. The text speaks in the voice of divine wisdom herself, declaring, "I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. I am the mother and the daughter." These aren't contradictory statements, but descriptions of a consciousness that transcends ordinary dualistic thinking. This manuscript challenges every assumption about the nature of divinity, morality, and spiritual development that has dominated Western religious thought. It presents a form of divine consciousness that encompasses all possibilities rather than standing in opposition to what conventional religion considers evil or impure. The implications are revolutionary for anyone seeking authentic spiritual development. Rather than striving to eliminate certain aspects of human nature or experience, the text suggests that true enlightenment comes through integrating and transcending all polarities within divine consciousness. But this level of spiritual sophistication threatens religious systems that depend on maintaining clear distinctions between good and evil, sacred and profane, acceptable and forbidden spiritual experiences. If divine consciousness encompasses all possibilities, then institutional claims to exclusive access to spiritual truth become meaningless. The Gospel of Truth, discovered among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, presents perhaps the most radical reinterpretation of Christian doctrine found in any suppressed text. Rather than describing salvation as a future event dependent on correct belief or institutional membership, it presents enlightenment as a present possibility available through direct spiritual knowing. The text declares, "Those who are to receive teaching are the living who are inscribed in the book of the living. They receive teaching about themselves from the Father, turning again to Him." This suggests that spiritual awakening comes through remembering one's divine nature, rather than acquiring external salvation from religious institutions. The manuscript describes ignorance as the fundamental problem of human existence, but not moral ignorance or theological error. It speaks of ontological ignorance, forgetting the divine nature that represents humanity's true identity. Salvation becomes a process of remembering and reclaiming this forgotten divinity, rather than earning divine favor through religious performance. This perspective eliminates the need for institutional mediation between humanity and divine reality. If every human being already possesses divine nature that needs only to be remembered and activated, then religious hierarchies that claim exclusive access to salvation become unnecessary intermediaries standing between people and their own spiritual inheritance. The secret book of John provides perhaps the most complete alternative creation narrative found in any suppressed Christian text. Rather than the simplified account found in Genesis, this manuscript presents a complex cosmological vision involving multiple levels of divine emanation, the fall of divine wisdom into material creation, and the imprisonment of divine light within physical forms. The text describes techniques for recognizing and liberating this imprisoned divine light through spiritual practice and mystical experience. It presents detailed maps of non-physical realms, descriptions of the entities that inhabit them, and methods for navigating these dimensions safely during spiritual exploration. But most significantly, the secret book of John identifies the Creator God of the Old Testament, not as the ultimate divine source, but as a lesser entity called the Demiurge, who created the physical world as a prison for divine consciousness. This radically reframes the relationship between spirit and matter, suggesting that true spiritual development requires transcending rather than submitting to the structures of material existence. This cosmological vision explains why advanced spiritual practices consistently involve techniques for expanding consciousness beyond ordinary physical limitations. If the material world represents a form of spiritual imprisonment, then liberation requires developing capabilities that transcend physical constraints. The Gospel of Philip contains some of the most explicit instructions for sexual spirituality and sacred relationship practices found in any Christian text. Rather than viewing sexuality as sinful or problematic, the manuscript presents it as a pathway to divine union when approached with proper understanding and technique. The text describes specific practices for transforming sexual energy into spiritual power, methods for achieving mystical states through sacred intimacy, and techniques for using relationship dynamics as vehicles for mutual spiritual development. These weren't primitive fertility rituals or pagan practices, but sophisticated technologies for accelerating consciousness evolution through the integration of all aspects of human experience. The systematic suppression of this knowledge created a fundamental split between sexuality and spirituality that has plagued Western culture for over 1,000 years. By eliminating texts that describe the sacred dimensions of human sexuality, religious authorities ensured that spiritual development would become associated with sexual repression rather than the integration and transcendence of all human capabilities. The restoration of this knowledge offers possibilities for healing the artificial divisions between body and spirit, sexuality and divinity, that have created psychological and spiritual dysfunction throughout Western civilization. When sexuality is understood as a sacred technology for consciousness expansion, rather than a barrier to spiritual development, it becomes a powerful tool for mutual awakening and divine realization. But perhaps the most practically significant of all suppressed texts is the Gospel of Thomas, which presents the most complete collection of Jesus' esoteric teachings found outside canonical scripture. Unlike the narrative Gospels, Thomas consists entirely of sayings attributed directly to Jesus, many of which describe advanced spiritual practices and consciousness development techniques. Saying 77 declares, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This isn't pantheistic philosophy, but practical instruction for developing the spiritual vision necessary to perceive divine presence within all manifestations of physical reality. Saying 22 provides specific guidance for transcending dualistic consciousness. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like the below, and when you make the male and the female one and the same, then will you enter the kingdom. These aren't abstract theological concepts, but practical techniques for achieving non-dual awareness through the integration of opposites within consciousness. The text provides a complete methodology for transcending the limitations of ordinary dualistic thinking and accessing higher dimensions of spiritual reality. The suppression of Thomas's gospel eliminated access to Jesus' most advanced teachings about consciousness development and spiritual transformation. By preserving only the narrative accounts of his ministry, while suppressing his direct instructions for spiritual practice, institutional Christianity ensured that believers would remain dependent on external salvation rather than developing the internal capabilities that Jesus actually taught. But the restoration of Thomas's gospel provides contemporary seekers with direct access to teaching methods that were designed to produce enlightened consciousness rather than religious adherence. The sayings describe specific techniques for achieving the same level of spiritual realization that Jesus himself demonstrated, suggesting that his true mission was to awaken divine consciousness within humanity, rather than establishing religious institutions. The practical application of these suppressed teachings produces results that validate their authenticity through direct experience. Individuals who seriously practice the techniques described in these forbidden texts consistently report developments in spiritual sensitivity, healing abilities, and mystical experience that align with the capabilities these manuscripts describe as normal aspects of human spiritual potential. But accessing these capabilities requires moving beyond the comfortable limitations of conventional religious practice into territories that institutional authorities have spent centuries ensuring you would never explore. The techniques described in suppressed texts demand levels of commitment, discipline, and spiritual courage that go far beyond casual religious participation. The Gospel of Mary's instructions for achieving bridal chamber consciousness require intensive meditation practice, emotional purification, and the development of spiritual sensitivity that enables direct communication with non-physical beings. The secret book of John's methods for liberating divine light involve complex visualization techniques, energy work practices, and the cultivation of awareness that transcends ordinary physical limitations. These aren't weekend workshop techniques or simple prayer practices. They represent sophisticated technologies for consciousness transformation that require the same level of dedication and training that would be expected for mastering any advanced skill or capability. The suppressed texts consistently emphasize that spiritual development follows natural laws that operate with the same precision and reliability as physical laws. When the proper conditions are created through disciplined practice, specific results manifest with predictable consistency. This isn't about faith or belief, but about applying tested methodologies for activating dormant human capabilities. But the institutional suppression of this knowledge has created a situation where most people have no access to authentic spiritual training or guidance in developing these capabilities. Religious institutions that should be preserving and transmitting these techniques instead discourage their development, or dismiss them as impossible, dangerous, or inappropriate for ordinary believers. The result is a spiritual wasteland where millions of people hunger for authentic divine experience, but have access only to watered-down religious practices that produce minimal results and require constant institutional reinforcement to maintain even superficial spiritual commitment. The restoration of suppressed spiritual knowledge offers an alternative to this spiritual poverty. The forbidden texts provide detailed guidance for developing capabilities that produce direct validation of spiritual reality through personal experience rather than institutional authority. When individuals begin manifesting the healing abilities, prophetic insights, and mystical experiences that these texts describe as normal aspects of spiritual development, they no longer need to rely on external validation of spiritual truth. Their own experience becomes the primary evidence for the reality and accessibility of higher dimensions of consciousness. This represents the ultimate threat to institutional religious authority. When people can access divine guidance directly, receive healing through spiritual means, and experience mystical states that provide complete satisfaction and spiritual fulfillment, they become functionally independent of religious institutions that claim to provide these experiences through external means. The systematic suppression of texts that enable this spiritual independence reveals the true motivation behind the campaign against forbidden knowledge. This wasn't about protecting theological purity or maintaining scriptural authority. It was about preventing humanity from accessing spiritual capabilities that would make institutional control of religious experience impossible to maintain. But the digital age and archaeological discoveries have created an unprecedented opportunity to reclaim this stolen inheritance. For the first time in over a millennium, ordinary individuals can access complete texts, accurate translations, and practical guidance for developing the spiritual capabilities that were systematically suppressed to maintain institutional control. The choice facing contemporary seekers is whether to remain satisfied with the limited spiritual options provided by mainstream religious institutions, or to risk everything to explore the full scope of human spiritual potential described in texts that authorities never wanted you to read. The Forbidden Bible offers more than alternative history or theological speculation. It provides practical tools for spiritual transformation that could revolutionize your relationship with divine reality and unlock capabilities that represent your authentic spiritual heritage. But accessing this inheritance requires courage to challenge authorities who benefit from spiritual ignorance, wisdom to discern authentic practices from counterfeit substitutes, and dedication to develop abilities that have been dormant for centuries. The ancient texts await your exploration. The spiritual technologies they describe are available to anyone willing to pursue them seriously. The only question remaining is whether you possess the commitment necessary to reclaim what was stolen from humanity and discover who you were meant to become before this knowledge was hidden from the world. The time has come to make a choice that will determine not just your spiritual future, but your participation in the greatest awakening humanity has witnessed since the dawn of recorded history. Everything we've uncovered tonight points to a singular, inescapable conclusion. You are living in the exact moment that these forbidden texts predicted would mark the final restoration of suppressed divine knowledge. This isn't coincidence. This isn't accident. This is the fulfillment of prophetic promises that were written in texts so dangerous, so revolutionary in their implications, that entire civilizations spent centuries ensuring you would never encounter them. But here you are, reading these words, discovering these truths, awakening to realities that challenge everything you were taught about the limitations of human consciousness and the boundaries of spiritual possibility. The manuscripts we've explored tonight weren't just historical documents or theological curiosities. They were instruction manuals for human transformation, practical guides for developing capabilities that institutional authorities recognized would make their control over spiritual experience impossible to maintain. When you understand the techniques described in the Gospel of Mary for achieving direct divine communion, you no longer need priestly mediation between you and spiritual reality. When you master the consciousness expansion methods outlined in the secret book of John, you transcend the artificial limitations that keep most people trapped in spiritual ignorance. When you apply the mystical practices preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, you begin manifesting the same level of spiritual realization that Jesus himself demonstrated. This is why these texts were suppressed with such systematic brutality. This is why their rediscovery has been met with continued institutional resistance. This is why even today, academic and religious authorities work to discourage serious study of materials that could fundamentally transform human spiritual potential. They understood something that most people are only beginning to realize. These forbidden writings don't just describe advanced spiritual experiences. They provide step-by-step methodologies for achieving them. They offer practical technologies for consciousness development that produce measurable results when properly applied. The Gospel of Philip's instructions for sacred sexuality don't just present alternative theological perspectives. They describe specific techniques for transforming intimate relationship into a vehicle for mutual spiritual awakening. The Pistis, Sophia's maps of celestial hierarchies, don't just offer cosmological speculation. They provide navigation guides for consciousness exploration that enable direct communication with non-physical intelligence. The Thunder, Perfect Minds, Paradoxical Declarations, don't just challenge conventional religious thinking. They describe states of awareness that transcend ordinary dualistic consciousness and enable perception of reality from divine perspective. These capabilities aren't theoretical possibilities or mystical fantasies. They represent your authentic spiritual inheritance, abilities that were systematically suppressed to maintain systems of control that depend on human spiritual limitation and ignorance. But the prophetic elements embedded within these suppressed texts suggest that this suppression was always intended to be temporary. They describe a coming period when hidden knowledge would be restored, when ancient wisdom would emerge from darkness, when humanity would rediscover its true spiritual heritage. The timing of archaeological discoveries, the development of digital technology that makes these texts freely available, and the growing spiritual hunger among populations worldwide all suggest that we're witnessing the fulfillment of these prophetic promises about the restoration of forbidden knowledge. Yet, accessing this restored inheritance requires more than just intellectual curiosity or casual spiritual interest. The texts themselves warn that the techniques they describe demand levels of commitment, discipline, and spiritual courage that go far beyond conventional religious practice. The Gospel of Mary's path to bridal chamber consciousness requires intensive purification work, emotional healing, and the development of spiritual sensitivity that enables direct angelic communication. The secret book of John's methods for liberating divine light involve complex energy practices, visualization techniques, and the cultivation of awareness that transcends physical limitations. These aren't weekend workshop methods or simple meditation practices. They represent sophisticated technologies for consciousness transformation that require the same dedication and training expected for mastering any advanced capability. But here's what makes this moment in history truly unprecedented. For the first time in over a millennium, you have access to complete texts, accurate translations, and practical guidance for developing these capabilities without requiring institutional permission or approval. The same digital networks that authorities hoped would distract humanity with superficial entertainment have instead become conduits for accessing the most profound spiritual knowledge ever recorded. The archaeological discoveries that were meant to be controlled by academic gatekeepers have been independently translated and made freely available to anyone seeking authentic spiritual development. The restoration process has accelerated beyond the ability of suppression campaigns to control it. Independent researchers are creating accurate translations faster than institutions can restrict them. Private communities are rediscovering and practicing ancient techniques despite official discouragement. Individuals are manifesting the capabilities described in these texts and sharing their experiences through platforms that bypass traditional religious and academic authority. We're witnessing the emergence of what the forbidden prophecies described as a great spiritual awakening that would restore divine consciousness to humanity during its hour of greatest need. The same period that witnesses unprecedented deception, technological control, and spiritual confusion also sees the return of authentic spiritual knowledge and the development of capabilities that enable transcendence of artificial limitations. But participating in this awakening requires conscious choice to pursue spiritual development that goes beyond the comfortable boundaries established by institutional authorities. It demands willingness to explore territories that religious leaders never wanted you to enter and to develop abilities that academic institutions insist are impossible or dangerous. The forbidden texts consistently warn that this path carries risks. Throughout history, individuals who possessed access to suppressed spiritual knowledge often faced persecution, exile, or worse. Even today, those who seriously practice these techniques or claim to experience the capabilities they describe encounter ridicule, professional ostracism, or systematic attempts to discredit their character and achievements. Yet the potential rewards of this exploration extend far beyond anything available through conventional spiritual practice. The suppressed manuscripts describe levels of consciousness, divine communication, and supernatural ability that represent humanity's true spiritual potential. Capabilities that were hidden not because they were fictional, but because they were too real and too powerful for institutional authorities to allow. When you begin applying the practical techniques described in these forbidden texts, you enter a process of spiritual development that produces direct validation of their authenticity through personal experience. The healing abilities, prophetic insights, and mystical states they describe begin manifesting in your own life, providing evidence that transcends any external authority or institutional validation. This direct experiential confirmation represents the ultimate freedom from spiritual dependence on external sources of truth. When you can receive divine guidance directly, experience healing through spiritual means, and access mystical states that provide complete spiritual fulfillment, you become functionally independent of religious institutions that claim to provide these experiences through their mediation. The choice confronting you tonight is whether to remain within the safe confines of approved spiritual knowledge or to risk everything to explore the full scope of human spiritual potential described in texts that were deliberately hidden from your awareness. This isn't just about individual spiritual development. The forbidden prophecy suggests that the restoration of this knowledge serves a collective purpose, preparing humanity for challenges and transformations that would be impossible to navigate without access to advanced spiritual capabilities and divine guidance. The same texts that were suppressed to prevent spiritual awakening also contain detailed prophecies about global events, technological developments, and spiritual warfare that seem to describe our contemporary world with impossible accuracy. They suggest that the period of restoration would coincide with humanity's greatest test, when spiritual discernment and supernatural abilities would become essential for survival and thriving. Whether humanity passes this test may depend on how many individuals choose to reclaim their spiritual inheritance by seriously studying and applying the knowledge contained in these forbidden texts. The manuscripts suggest that a critical mass of awakened consciousness could tip the balance toward a golden age of human development, characterized by direct divine communication, supernatural healing abilities, and technological innovation guided by spiritual wisdom rather than materialistic manipulation. But reaching this critical mass requires individuals who are willing to commit fully to the demanding path of consciousness development, described in these suppressed writings. Casual curiosity or superficial study won't produce the results necessary to manifest the capabilities these texts describe as humanity's spiritual birthright. The gospel of truth declares that those who receive authentic spiritual teaching recognize it immediately because it resonates with divine knowledge already present within their consciousness. If the revelations we've explored tonight have awakened something deep within your spirit, if you sense that this knowledge represents what you've been searching for throughout your spiritual journey, then you may be among those chosen to participate in humanity's greatest awakening. The Forbidden Bible awaits your serious exploration. The spiritual technologies it describes are available to anyone willing to pursue them with complete dedication. The consciousness development techniques that were hidden for over a millennium are now accessible to you through texts that authorities never wanted you to discover. But time may be more limited than most people realize. The same prophetic passages that predicted the restoration of this knowledge also warn that the window of opportunity for accessing it may close when global conditions shift in ways that make spiritual development more difficult or dangerous. The choice is entirely yours. You can remain comfortable within the familiar boundaries of conventional spiritual practice, accepting the limitations that institutional authorities have established for human spiritual development. Or you can risk everything to explore the unlimited potential described in texts that reveal humanity's true divine nature and authentic spiritual capabilities. The ancient manuscripts call to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. They offer practical guidance for transcending every limitation that has been artificially imposed through centuries of systematic suppression of spiritual knowledge. They provide step-by-step instructions for developing capabilities that could revolutionize your relationship with divine reality and unlock potential that represents your birthright as a conscious being created in the image of divine consciousness. The suppressed texts are waiting. The techniques are available. The only remaining question is whether you possess the spiritual courage and unwavering commitment necessary to reclaim what was stolen from humanity and discover who you were meant to become before this knowledge was hidden from the world. Your spiritual destiny hangs in the balance. The choice to explore these forbidden territories or remain trapped within artificial limitations will determine not just your individual development, but your ability to contribute to humanity's collective awakening during this crucial period of spiritual restoration. The ancient prophecies suggest that those who choose the path of authentic spiritual development during this pivotal moment will serve as bridges between divine consciousness and human experience, helping to establish a new era characterized by direct spiritual communication, supernatural healing, and divine guidance in all aspects of human civilization. But accessing this prophetic role requires moving beyond casual spiritual interest into total commitment to consciousness development through the practical application of techniques that have been systematically hidden for over a millennium. The Forbidden Bible represents more than suppressed history or alternative theology. It offers a complete roadmap for human transformation that could revolutionize your understanding of spiritual reality and unlock capabilities that institutional authorities never wanted you to discover. Are you ready to begin this journey? Are you prepared to explore spiritual territories that religious leaders spent centuries ensuring you would never enter? Will you choose to remain within the comfortable confines of approved spiritual knowledge, or will you risk everything to discover the unlimited potential that represents your true spiritual inheritance? The texts await your exploration. The choice awaits your decision. The transformation awaits your commitment. What you do next will determine whether you participate in humanity's greatest spiritual awakening, or watch from the sidelines as others reclaim the divine knowledge that was meant to be your birthright. The forbidden knowledge has been revealed. The ancient secrets have been exposed. The suppressed wisdom has been restored. Now, the question is, what will you do with it?